Things are changing for Colorado. Are they going to be good? Are they going to be Are they going to be great? Are they going to be bad? We don't know. We're going to find out. But one thing we do know is that they do play Oregon, and we're going to talk about that game and more on today's episode of Locked On Buffs.
You are Locked On Buffs, your daily podcast on the Colorado Buffaloes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, everybody? This is Locked On Buffs. I am Kevin Borber. Today we're talking about the Oregon matchup, and we have a special guest joining us. But before we get to our special guest and the Oregon matchup, I need you guys to know that this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you could get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season at FanDuel.com/lockedon. And now for our special guest, Max Torres, the writer, publisher of Ducks Digest. Max, how you doing? Thank you for joining us.
I'm great, Kevin. Thanks for having me. Football is in the air, so excited for the season.
It feels like it's been a while since football's been in the air. We've been talking about everything but football in the air. Let's dive right in. Oregon and Colorado, they open up Pac-12 play with each other. And last season, it did not go as planned for Colorado. They lost by a score of 49-10 en route to going 1-11 on the year. And Oregon obviously had a much better year. They didn't make it to the Pac-12 title game like they had hoped, but things look to be on the come up this year. If you were to talk about like one point about this game that stands out this year compared to last season, what do you think that would be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, obviously it's just the roster overhaul for Deion. I think that's been a huge talking point in Boulder this whole offseason. And then for Oregon, I think that you have to look at the defense, because I think that's maybe where there's, I don't know if I'd say as much of a question mark, but I think that's kind of where this matchup is a little bit more interesting. I think that Oregon's offense is probably going to be able to take care of business, even though Colorado brought in a lot of good pieces like Travis Hunter from Jackson State. But I think Deion Sanders, assuming he wins the starting job, is going to present a unique challenge for Oregon, seeing that he definitely fits that dual threat quarterback mold. And Oregon wasn't good at getting after the quarterback last year. In fact, they were really mediocre, if not poor. So I think that the defensive front is going to be in for a test when the Buffs come to town and kick off Pac-12 play. But fortunately for Oregon, they did add a couple of big pieces since the end of last season, most notably Jordan Burch, the South Carolina transfer, who's like 6'6", 275 pounds. So they're really kind of hinging their hopes on his ability to really take the next step in his development. And then for him to work alongside guys like Brandon Dorless, a veteran coming back, Popo Amavai, Casey Rogers, and then you also have Mateo Uiagalelei, who was a huge recruiting win for Dan Lanning, one of the best edge rushers in the country out of St. John Bosco. I think he's going to be competing for snaps sooner than later, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see him in that game.
Yeah, I think the thing that stands out for me is it's kind of hard to look at last year's game and be like, you know what, this happened last year, so we gotta I kind of think we have to throw last year out the window, because realistically, Colorado's returning 10 players from last year's team that were on scholarship. It's a completely different roster. And like you said, I think both teams are headed in different directions right now. I think Colorado's kind of, if everything goes right, they could be 3-0 by the time they get to Oregon. I think most people expect them to be 2-1 at the best with losses to TCU, or 1-2 with losses to TCU and Nebraska. I think this matchup, depending on how Colorado starts the season, I think that will also kind of determine how they do in this game. So if they start the season, say 3-0, they beat TCU at TCU, then they come home, beat Nebraska, and then they beat Colorado State, I think the confidence around the program and the confidence around the country would probably be through the roof. The hype would probably be unreal. They'd probably be a top 25 team, if we're being honest, if they beat those two teams early in the year. What do you think the difficult things could be for Oregon and Colorado in this matchup this year?
Yeah, I think we were talking about this a little bit just before we recorded about how Colorado is kind of one big mystery. And I think that's kind of to your point about we just don't really know what to expect from this year's team. And we can't put too much stock in last year's game. So I feel like preparing for a well-coached Colorado team, because frankly, they just haven't been very well coached, and they also haven't had good pieces. A lot of these guys that you see that Oregon is going to be lining up against when this matchup comes in September, they're not going to be your typical Colorado caliber guy. which speaks to the success that Deion's had in the transfer portal and obviously on the tail end of the 2023 recruiting cycle, getting some really big flips, some really big pieces. So I think that could be a little bit of a challenge for Oregon, just in terms of not taking your foot off the gas and not looking at this Colorado matchup through the lens that they're used to looking at. So all of that said, we seriously don't know what to expect, but maybe Colorado's first couple of games, which are coming against some pretty good opponents in TCU and Nebraska, I think Oregon's really going to be grinding the tape to see what they can glean from those guys. I think one thing that definitely stands out that could be a little bit of a challenge for Colorado is containing Oregon's wide receivers. They definitely have some of the best wide receivers in the Pac-12. Headline, of course, by Troy Franklin, who's a Biletnikoff Award watch list guy, leading receiver from a year ago, but they bolstered their receiving core with a bunch of big weapons. Gary Bryant Jr. from USC, Trayshawn Holden from Alabama, Tez Johnson from Troy. And then you also have five-star wide receiver Dreon Dickey from a year ago. And we haven't even talked about Chris Hudson. So there's so many pieces. I feel like even if Travis Hunter and Cormani McClain can really do their thing, we could really see Oregon's wide receiver depth come into play here and really make this one a difficult matchup for them.
Yeah, I also think another thing that I honestly thought you were going to bring it up too is the difficulty of playing at Oregon.
No doubt.
That's going to be a difficult, because I would say TCU, I'm sure they're going to get a big turnout. It's going to be week 1. But I would say Autzen Stadium is probably one of the more hostile environments. So kind of talk about the difficulty of playing there and what other teams do, like how they do there, because it's not great for the most part.
Yeah, Oregon definitely has one of the best home records in all of college football. It's not too often that you see a team come into Autzen and come away with a win. But that did happen last year, so it's not like Oregon's invincible. I was at that Washington game, which was a crazy, crazy game. And then obviously once Bo Nix got hurt, everything kind of fell off the rails for the Ducks. That was like a death march in Star Wars on that drive. You knew Oregon was going to score, but once Bo got hurt and had to miss some time, I think they settled for a field goal. Either way, they didn't score a touchdown, which is what they needed to do to win that game. So I think you see teams, I don't know if I'd say struggle all the time, because I don't want to, be over here like, oh my God, Autzen's the best atmosphere in the country. I'm a little biased just because I lived out there and gone to a bunch of games, but they're loud. Autzen Stadium is incredibly loud, especially given the size. It's under 60,000 fans. So I think that when you're looking at it from a numbers standpoint, people maybe take that for granted a little bit. But those folks in Eugene and Portland, and then across the country, they show up and they travel pretty well. So I think that it's definitely setting itself up to be a tough first Pac-12 game for Deion Sanders and the Buffs. And they're going to have to be disciplined and locked in and communicating well. So it's a tough venue for sure, but you get to go to I thought it was in Lincoln, my bad. That's a home game against Nebraska. So other than that TCU game, this is going to be, the first true road test for the Buffs, and it's not going to be an easy one for my money.
Yeah, I think Colorado's going to go into every game, especially away games, is kind of like enemy number 1. Like I feel like everybody's going to want to see them be beat even more than a normal college football team just because Coach Prime's there, which we're going to get to in a little bit. But this episode, again, is brought to you by FanDuel. If you like to gamble and you like to put some money on your favorite football team, football season is about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long. Because right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets for every victory. You could use your bonus bets on the spread, the player props, over and unders. And so if you want to get into all the action, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Okay, Max, we talked about the matchup itself. What's changed for Oregon? Because I know for Colorado, I'll dive into it before you dive into Oregon. Obviously, new Coach Prime is there. They brought in a defensive coordinator from Alabama. They brought in Sean Lewis, the offensive coordinator from Kent State, who runs one of the fastest offenses in the country. I think it's kind of maybe an ode to Chip Kelly at Oregon when he kind of got that going. The quick offenses that don't huddle and just try to run like 5 plays before you could even react to the third play. And I think Colorado, obviously, they have a roster full of transfers, a lot of new talent. So that's what's changed for Colorado. And I think the attitude around the program has changed too. What's something that's changed for Oregon?
Yeah, there's been quite a bit of change for Oregon this offseason, just since the end of last year. The most notable one is probably that they lost Kenny Dillingham, their offensive coordinator, who absolutely lit up opposing defenses with Bo Nix leading the way. He's now in Tempe, new head coach at Arizona State. So he's gone, and Will Stein comes in from UTSA. Definitely an up-and-coming coach and someone who's put up a lot of really good numbers with the Roadrunners this past year. And I think that he's someone who walks into a really good situation, obviously with Bo Nix coming back. A lot of really good returners on that offense, especially at the wide receiver position. Amazing running back core. So I think the Will Stein offense is absolutely something that's changed. We got a little bit of a taste of it in the spring game, but you can never take too much away from that. So that is definitely a significant change for Oregon, just offensively, big picture. And then you're also hoping that their defense is going to change, because it was good, not great, I think is the easiest way to talk about it last year. Pretty solid against the run, terrible on third down, and really pretty poor against the pass. And that's even with Christian Gonzalez, who was dominating last year en route to becoming a first-round pick. So I think you also have to look at some of the ways that defense is changing. The cornerback spot's kind of a question mark for me. The whole secondary is a little bit of a question mark, but not in the traditional sense, Kevin. It's really that they have pieces that are there, but those pieces that are there haven't really done anything crazy special, and they've really brought in a lot of new faces at safety, at corner. So I think that no one's job should really be viewed as safe, and this could be looking like a much different unit, and the pressure is definitely on for them to raise the standard and really start playing like what we thought the Dan Lanning defense would look like.
Yeah, and I was gonna touch on the defense, so I'm glad you brought it up, because I think last season, if Oregon had an Achilles heel, it was their defense. We saw Oregon State kind of take advantage of them in the run game. We saw other teams it seemed like every week there was something different that just wasn't working. And so I think this year, if they could be more consistent as a defense, that team, the sky's the limit. The other thing that I wanted to touch on again, because you brought it up, was the change in coordinator. Obviously, we know Bo Nix. He was one of the top quarterbacks. I think he's probably a top 5 quarterback in college football right now. Probably top 3, top 4 at worst. But the thing that has changed for him is no Kenny Dillingham, like you mentioned. And we've seen when he doesn't have Kenny Dillingham in his 2 years at Auburn, that he didn't have him, wasn't really the same quarterback. But when he did have him, his numbers were really solid. So what is something that we've seen from maybe Bo Nix this spring that kind of indicates that even though Kenny's not there, he could still be the guy we saw last year?
Yeah, this has been a really important spring for Bo Nix, who's entering his 5th and final season of college football. I think really you just have to look at his demeanor and how he's continued and picked up right where he left off last year as a leader. Because when Bo Nix committed to Oregon, Kevin, I was shocked. I was like, is this really happening? And I feel like that wasn't just because he started his career against Oregon in that non-conference game in Jerry's World, but I had this kind of ongoing joke with one of my roommates in Eugene who said, dude, it would be such a meme if Bo Nix committed to Oregon. And then it actually happened. So it was just unbelievable that it happened, and I had to kind of just wrap my head around it. But he's really grown as a quarterback, man. He really has, I think, honed in on all the strengths in his game and kind of tried to mask some of the weaknesses. I've looked most notably at just kind of taking what the defense gave him last year. At Auburn, he was so streaky, so hot and cold, because he would have these amazing plays one series, and then the next series, you're like, dude, what are you doing? Like, get rid of the ball or take care of the ball. That was something that he really excelled at Oregon. So I just really feel like he's the most comfortable he's ever been. He has he has Troy Franklin, his go-to receiver, back. Also has Terrence Ferguson, the leading tight end for Oregon a year ago, and all these new weapons coming in, and a great running back core too. So I really feel like everything's kind of falling in place for him to have a good year, even though you're facing some question marks along the offensive line. I just think that Bo Nix is a gamer. He's experienced. He's smart. And I think he's the guy that you want to, have leading your offense. And just because it's a new coach, I don't think that there's anything I don't really think he's going to be taking a step back by any means.
Yeah, I had to apologize to Bo Nix, because back when he was at Auburn, me and my friend, who's a Florida Gator fan, we would always talk about, I don't know if you remember the Ole Miss quarterback, Bo Wallace, but there was always this good Bo, bad Bo kind of joke where, like, sometimes, like you said, he'd be electric, and then other times it'd be like this guy's terrible. And so we kind of were like, it's the name. So Bo Nix at Auburn kind of had that same thing where it was like he'd be really good at times, and other times it's like not the best. And so we were like good Bo, bad Bo. And I think he kind of eliminated bad Bo outside of the Georgia game, which I mean, who really played well against Georgia? Like you show me a quarterback that tore up that Georgia defense, and I'll pay you $100 because really no quarterback tore them up. It was just, I think that was a tough game for him to kind of start off his Oregon career, but he really hit a stride down the rest of the way. So, yeah, this is my official apology to Bo Nix. I just think it'll be interesting to see how he progresses. I do think he's one of the best quarterbacks in the country. When we come back, we're going to be talking about the pressure that both of these teams are facing. It's very different, but it's still pressure. Okay, Max, we're talking about pressure. Max covers the Ducks for Ducks Digest, the Fan Nation site. My fellow coworker of the Pac-12, formerly known as the Pac-12. After this, the Pac-4. Max is going to be off to the Big Ten. I'm going to be covering Stanford at who knows what conference they'll be in, maybe independent. Either way, we're here. We're talking about the pressure. I'll talk about Colorado's pressure. I think Coach Prime being the coach puts on pressure. I think there's going to be pressure to make a bowl game because even though there shouldn't be, I think just because of his persona, kind of the energy he brings and just the overall amount of people that dislike him, I think they're going to need to see something significant from him. What's the pressure that Oregon's facing in 2023?
Yeah, I think that Oregon's facing quite a bit of pressure for a number of reasons. I talked about the defense. We talked about the defense and just kind of how it was really subpar last year, not only with the talent that they had on paper, but also with the coaches that they had. Dan Lanning coming off that national championship at Georgia, I think that's been a really interesting thing to kind of unpack because he obviously played a tremendous role in that defense as the defensive coordinator at Georgia. But it wasn't just him. You had Glenn Schumann. You had Kirby Smart. So in some cases, I feel like Oregon fans were having these grand expectations that their defense is just going to be unbelievable because they had Dan Lanning. But clearly that wasn't the case. But then at the same time, you're also seeing, I like to cover recruiting a lot, and you're seeing that Georgia defense, the development there also being a selling point for Dan Lanning. So he absolutely deserves a whole heck of a lot of credit, but at the same time, you couldn't expect Oregon's defense to become Georgia's defense just because you hired Dan Lanning. But with that said, I think that there is a lot of pressure for this defense to be the best in the Pac-12 because of the pieces that they added through the transfer portal and through the recruiting ranks, the high school ranks, that is. And then also because Oregon lost both of its rivalry games last year in pretty much the worst fashion you could have imagined. You didn't get blown out by Washington at home, but you had that one in the bag and you completely let it slip away. And then you just looked like you had no heart and didn't even want to be there against Oregon State. So I think there's pressure to win those rivalry games, especially because we don't know what the future of the Oregon State rivalry is going to be with Oregon heading to the Big 12 or Big 10, excuse me. So there's pressure for that defense to really up its game and become an elite unit, I would think. But then also there's pressure on Will Stein to make a name for himself as the offensive coordinator at Oregon. There's pressure on Bo Nix to try to replicate what he did last year. And then I think there's also a separate pressure on Alik Terry, who's the new offensive line coach who comes in to take over for Adrian Clem, who had a stellar unit last year. Now that Clem is with the Patriots, the team that drafted him when he was in the NFL. But Alik Terry comes back to Oregon, served on that staff under Mario Cristobal. Then he went over to Hawaii, coached on the Minnesota Vikings. So there's some pressure there for that offensive line group to really show, hey, just because we have a new coach, just because we lost a bunch of vets from last year, the standard's there, and we're going to meet it.
Yeah. Okay. So I like everything you dove into. Now we're going to dive into before we head out because the show's almost over. What is a success for Oregon and Colorado, and what is a failure? I think a success for Colorado is a bowl game. I think that'd be a great first year for Coach Prime. Obviously, you come off a 1-11 roster or 1-11 team, completely revamp the roster. I think a failure would be, let's say they just like automatically fall flat on their face. Excuse me, that was hard to say, and win like 3 games or 2 games or something. And it's like, I think the expectation is 4 to 5 wins, and I think that's okay. But I think 2 wins would be like, oof. What's going wrong? Did this experiment fail? What is a success for Oregon and what is a failure in 2023?
Yeah, this can go a lot of different ways, Kevin, because Oregon's at such an interesting spot. They've always been knocking on the door of the Pac-12 title, of going back to the playoffs even. But I think a success for Oregon is probably at least 10 wins and getting back to the Pac-12 championship game. And I feel like that's kind of the floor that we're setting right now, because this is a team, everyone that I'm talking to around the program in Eugene, they fully expect to be competing for the playoffs this year, which is such an important year since it's the last year that it'll be 4 teams. So I'd say a success is 10 wins and getting back to the Pac-12 title game and probably going to a New Year's Six Bowl after going to the Holiday Bowl last year when they should have gone to the Pac-12 title game, but they couldn't take care of their business. So that's no one's fault but Oregon's. But a failure, oh man, I kind of feel like you're at the point where if you win less than 10 games, it's kind of a failure. You have a pretty tough schedule. Not the worst non-con with Portland State and Hawaii and Texas Tech. Certainly a step back from last year going against Georgia and BYU. But this is a tough schedule, Kevin. I mean, you have those non-con games. You have an early bye week, which comes right before the Washington game. But then you have to host USC. You have to go on the road to Salt Lake City. And to Tempe. That could be a trap game going against Kenny Dillingham. And then you have Oregon State to round out the regular season, which could also be kind of a trap game. You never know what can happen in rivalries. So I kind of feel like it sounds like you're asking a lot, but I think less than 10 wins would be a failure.
Oof, that's high expectations, but it totally makes sense because it's kind of like they got the quarterback, they got the weapons, they got everything. Whereas Colorado, it's like, I think Colorado just needs to see progress, but I also think Coach Prime's presence adds that extra pressure. I mean, you've seen it. I think every game that Colorado will play in this year will be nationally televised. I'm almost like 70% certain that's going to happen. They already have, I think it's 6 games on their schedule already scheduled to be televised. And I think it's going to continue. Even if they end up getting bumped from a few, like maybe they get a Pac-12 after dark slot every once in a while or something. But I think the pressure is just growing for both these teams. It's different pressure, like I said earlier, but it's still pressure. Max, I appreciate you for joining us. Tell the people where they can follow you and keep up with all the everything that's happening, all the Ducks info.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate that chance, Kevin. Thanks for having me on, by the way. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at mtorresports, that name right there on your screen. You can read my work covering Oregon football and recruiting over on ducksdigest.com. You can listen to me on my podcast, the Ducks Dish Podcast, and find me on YouTube at Oregon Football, Max Torres.
Thank you, Max, for joining us. You guys have a great day. I will see you guys tomorrow.